not only does a leader prepare the work and make provision for the materials that are needed, but a leader also shares the vision that God has given him. David had this vision for what the temple was to be. It was to be great, it was to be glorious, it was to be famous in all countries of the world, it was to be renowned, right? And David shares this vision with his son Solomon. He brings him alongside and says, listen, son, this is what this is going to be. This is what it's got to be like. You've got a great work here before you to do. And he shares that vision. Amen? So often we fail to share our vision with our children, right? We fail to communicate to them exactly what it is we hope to see building in their lives. You know, one of the things that I think I learned early on as a parent was when I would say no to my children, when they would come and ask me, hey, Dad, can we this? Or hey, Dad, can we go do that? If I were to say no, it wasn't enough to simply say no. I wanted them to understand why I had said no. I wanted them to understand the reasons and the motivations behind the no or behind the yes. My philosophy was say yes when you can and say no when you need to, right? I preferred to say yes as often as I could because I didn't want them to assume that everything was always going to be no. But when you need to say no, say no. That having been said, we should raise our children intentionally. If we say yes or if we say no, we should understand why we're saying yes and why we're saying no. And we should be willing to communicate that information to them. Now, sometimes the yes or the no is simply because I said so, right? There are times when we have neither the time nor the inclination nor the ability even to communicate the reasons behind a decision that we're making, because sometimes it's just a feeling and you've got to be obedient to that feeling. But you know what? It's okay to share that too. To say, you know what, son, I'm saying no to this, and I don't know why I'm saying no to it. I'm saying no to it, and I can't give you a reason for saying no to it, except to say that the Spirit of God within me is saying no. And if the Spirit of God within me is saying no, then I need to be obedient and say no, even if I would like to say yes. Amen? So we need to be able to communicate those things, and David is doing that. Now, that having been said, not only does a good and a godly leader prepare the work and make provision for those things that are needed, not only do they share the vision, but a good and a godly leader also recognizes their own faults and accepts responsibility for their failures or for their own actions. And we see that in David in these next verses. David said to Solomon in verse 7, "As for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me saying, you have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." Now you might say, wait a second, that's not fair. The battles that David fought most often were the battles that the Lord had commanded him to fight, right? So why would God not allow him to build the temple when it was God that he was obeying when he went to war? Because we're not all made for the same purpose, and we don't all fulfill the same role. And it was not David's place to be the one to build the temple. David, you could say, was a hammer. You don't use a hammer to screw in a screw, do you? You use a screwdriver for that. So David perhaps could be called a hammer, whereas Solomon perhaps was a Phillips head, right? They had different designs, they had different characters, they had different roles to play within the framework of what God wanted them to do. So a good and a godly leader recognizes their faults, but they also recognize things that aren't necessarily faults, but are limitations, right? We are not made to do everything. We are made to do something. We are not made to do every work. We are made to do that work which God has prepared in advance for us to walk in, according to Ephesians 2:10. Amen? And we don't all have the same function. We learn that from the writings of Paul, as each member of the body fulfills a different purpose and a different role. And it was not David's place to build the temple. That was reserved for Solomon. So a good and a godly leader recognizes their limitations.